The 12 Apostles, fabricated followers of a fabricated Saviour. Would the disciples have suffered and died for a fabricated Saviour? One of the reeds of straw holding up the shabby edifice of Christendom is the alleged suffering and cruel fate of his original apostles, the 12 disciples chosen by the Lord himself. By their heroic, cheek-turning sacrifice, these worthies earned their martyr's crown and joined their Lord in heaven. In so doing, they inspired generations of noble Christians who ultimately taught the bloodthirsty Romans the Christian values of compassion and brotherly love. Well, that's the myth. Though cruelty and human suffering have ever been integral to the history of the Church, the fanatics of Christ have rarely been the victimised innocents. Rather, it has been the Christians who have bathed their faith in the blood of others. There is no corroborating evidence for the existence of the 12 apostles, and absolutely no evidence for the colourful variety of martyrs' deaths they supposedly experienced. The Bible itself actually mentions the death of only 2 apostles, a James, who was put to death by Herod Agrippa, and the nasty Judas Iscariot, who gets several deaths because he's the bad guy. Legend and tradition alone, dreamed up by the early churches in their bid for legitimacy and authority, provided the uplifting fables of heroics and martyrdom. The plethora of conflicting claims and alternative deaths stand eloquent testimony to wholesale fabrication of the non-existent God-man's non-existent companion. The fabricated deaths of the apostles. From Edward Gibbon we have this. In the time of Tertullian and Clemens of Alexandria, the glory of martyrdom was confined to St. Peter, St. Paul and St. James. It was gradually bestowed on the rest of the apostles by the more recent Greeks, who prudently selected for the theatre of their preaching and suffering some remote country beyond the limits of the Roman Empire. Around the God-man, inventive minds fabricated a gang of shadowy disciples. These noble fellows were accorded a colourful variety of fictitious deaths, and their fanciful heroics were said to have inspired generations of loving Christians, who cruelly suffered persecutions at the hands of dastardly Roman emperors. Number 1. Peter, also known as Simon or Cephas. Beheaded by Nero? No, not really. This legend was dreamed up by the mid-2nd century Pope Anicetus, 156-166, when he became locked in a conflict with the venerable Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp had tried to win the argument over the dating of Easter by insisting that he spoke with the authority of the Apostle John. In response, Anicetus staked the claim to Peter, and Peter, Prince of the Apostles, trumps John. 2nd century texts known as the Clementines had made Peter the first bishop of Rome, and 3rd century invention gave him a 25-year pontificate, which made it a tad tricky for him to have died at the hands of Nero. But hey, this is tradition. 3rd century church father Origen dreamed up a colourful flourish. Peter, feeling himself unworthy to be crucified the same way as his Lord, chose option B, crucifixion upside down. James, son of Zebedee. Now Acts 12 says simply, "Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James the brother of John with the sword." Later legend adds the truly extraordinary nonsense that the Roman officer guarding James converted on the spot and elected to be beheaded beside him. Even later fabrication has James traipsing around northern Spain before he dashes back to Judea for martyrdom. Disciple number 3, John, son of Zebedee. This guy has to be kept alive long enough to take care of Mary, lead the church in Ephesus, write the book of Revelation, and write his own gospel. He even survives being boiled in oil and given a natural death. Number 4, Andrew, brother of Peter. Pious invention gives Andrew a wonderful career covering everywhere from Scythia to Greece, from Asia Minor to Thrace. This guy, it seems, took option C on the crucifixion menu, an X-shaped cross. Apparently, this allowed him to continue preaching for 2 days. Number 5, Philip. Fable places this guy in Phrygia, Carthage and Asia Minor. The fairy tale has a proconsul crucifying him for converting his wife. Perhaps the love feast got a bit out of hand. Number 6, Bartholomew, or Nathaniel. What a traveller! India, Persia, Armenia, Ethiopia and southern Arabia. Miraculously, he managed to get himself crucified, flayed alive and beheaded in both India and Armenia. Pretty impressive stuff. Even when dead, his bits got about. A church in Rome claimed most of his corpse, but 11th century Canterbury did a roaring trade with his arm. His emblem is the flaying knife. Cool. Number 7, Matthew, or Levi. This guy has to be kept alive long enough to write his gospel, at least 20 years after the supposed death of Christ. Credited with 15 years in Jerusalem, then missions to Persia and Ethiopia, and of course martyrdom in both places. According to medieval iconography, he wore spectacles, better to count his tax money. Number 8, Thomas Didymus, the twin. Another grand traveller, seen everywhere from Parthia to Kerala in South India. 4th century invention, appropriately enough, gives this twin 2 martyrdoms, one in Persia and one in India. He even gets a burial in Syria to boot. Yet another resting place, Mayapur, was claimed by the Portuguese in the 16th century. Most famous for his doubt, Thomas inspired a whole raft of pious flimflam. The Acts of Thomas, he apparently built a palace for an Indian king, would you believe? The Apocalypse of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Infant Gospel of Thomas. Now, have we still got any doubts? Number 9, James, son of Alphaeus. The myth makers really go to town with this guy. Thrown down over 100 feet from the pinnacle of the temple by scribes and Pharisees, he actually survived only to be stoned, have his brains dashed out with a fuller's club, and have his body sawn asunder. All this by the age of 90. Number 10, Jude, or so-called Thaddeus, Labius or Dadius. Either a serious clubbing or crucifixion for this mixed-up guy in the city of Edessa or Persia. Apparently his fan club suffered because his name sounded too much like Judas. Number 11, Simon the Canaanite or the Zealot. Invention came late for this guy. When it did, it was a beauty. Crucifixion in Persia and also crucifixion thousands of miles away in Britain. He also managed to preach in Africa. Quite an act to follow. Number 12, Matthias. Fantasy sends this guy to Syria, Cappadocia, the shores of the Caspian, and the city of the cannibals. That's according to Acts of Andrew and Matthias. Death by burning, also death in Jerusalem by stoning and beheading. Really just makes up the numbers, sometimes merging with Matthew and sometimes swapped out to let Paul into the 12. Number 13, Judas, son of James. Nothing yet. Feeling inspired? Number 14, Levi, son of Alphaeus. Nothing yet. Number 15, Mark or John Mark, Though neither Clement of Alexandria nor Origen of Alexandria seem to have noticed, Eusebius of Caesarea, around about 339, relays the news that the Apostle Mark had been first bishop of Alexandria and had suffered martyrdom in the 8th year of Nero. This would have been the year 61, rendering the apostle dead before the death of Peter, whose memoirs Mark supposedly wrote up in the Gospel of Mark. Dragged to death, or maybe not, his bones, well, someone's bones, turned up in 9th century Venice. Number 16, Luke, hanged on an olive tree, or lived to the age of 84 and died unmarried. Body parts claimed by both Padua and Constantinople. Number 17, Paul, beheaded by Nero. No, not really, but legend tells us he shares the same fate as Peter, even dying on the same day. Pious romances scribbled between the 2nd and 4th centuries, Acts of Paul, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Martyrdom of Paul, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, provide all the fabulous nonsense you could ever wish for. Judas, the fool guy. If the Jewish authorities, with their own agents, really had wanted to arrest a Jesus, supposedly a guru drawing vast crowds, they certainly would not have needed to hire an inside informer to identify the charismatic leader. Nor is it credible that big money would have been paid for, of all things, a kiss of the doomed Messiah. The theological symbolism is as apparent as the history is bogus. The mythic Judas was a Gentile Hellenistic creation of the early 2nd century, an eponymous focus for the anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism of the early church. Iscariot appears to have been taken from the name of a rebel group called Sicarii, Jewish assassins, who were largely exterminated shortly before the First Jewish War. Ignatius, writing his epistles about the year 115, made no mention of a Judas Iscariot, but then nor did he mention any disciple. Peter and Paul were called apostles, that is, missionaries like himself. But with a theological necessary betrayal by a Jew or the Jews, the divine Saviour passes body and soul into the possession of the Gentiles. In their disposal of Judas, the hapless traitor of the Lord, how could he help it? He had been entered by Satan. Did Jewish scribblers get quite carried away? But their multiple deaths are a biblical motif for making sure the bad guys get it really bad. King Saul had 4 different fates. Papias, in the 130s, got the ball rolling in the early 2nd century. Quote, Judas walked about in this world a sad example of impiety. For his body, having swollen to such an extent that he could not pass where a chariot could pass easily, he was crushed by the chariot, so that his bowels gushed out. 2 fairy tales which made the biblical edition. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. Matthew 27:5. Now this man purchased a field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst asunder in their midst, and all his bowels gushed out. Acts 1:18. There was a 4th century embellishment. Judas was a terrible walking example of ungodliness in this world, for his eyelids, they say, were so swollen that he could not see the light at all, and his eyes could not be seen. When he relieved himself, there passed through pus and worms from every part of his body, much to his shame. After much agony and punishment, they say, he finally died in his own place, and because of the stench, the area is deserted, uninhabitable even now. In fact, to this day, no one can pass that place unless they hold their nose. So great was the discharge from his body, and so far did it spread over the ground. Church of the Shadows. After the deaths of the apostles, even church historians offer no great missionary figures. They make a weak attempt with Ignatius. In an impressively entertaining tale of martyrdom and celebrity tour, the episcopal superstar gets sentenced to wild beasts by the dastardly emperor Trajan, in truth a famously benign ruler. We are asked to believe that, at a time when all of Rome's resources were being assembled for a war against Parthia, the emperor eschewed the perfectly serviceable local arena for Ignatius's execution and instead assigned a troop of guards to take their captives the long way round the Eastern Empire and back to Rome. The protracted journey afforded Ignatius the opportunity to meet and greet Christian worthies every step of the way. Along the journey, Ignatius, who is quite insistent upon his own martyrdom, writes 15 letters of a truly miraculous nature. They are addressed to such diverse notaries as the Virgin Mary and a bishop not even born at the time of Ignatius' death. The importance of the letters is not historical veracity but Catholic dogma. Ignatius is turned into the mouthpiece of 4th century orthodoxy, backdated into a 2nd century proselytizing fantasy. The obliging bishop warns the brethren of all manner of heresies and urges rigid obedience of their bishops. But for the most part, the gap of more than 2 centuries from the age of the apostles to the church triumphant is filled with an anonymous church of the shadows. Retrospectively, the void was filled with suffering Christians, a fallacy invented by a newly empowered church for its own greater glory, elaborated at length by the feverish minds of medieval churchmen and perpetuated in our own time by the studios of Hollywood. The mass production of saints. This, for example, is the story of St. Agatha, of uncertain date, supposedly a wealthy virgin of Sicily, who had vowed her chastity to Christ. Quintinian, a dastardly Roman consul, had designs on her virtue. Thwarted, he had Agatha put in a brothel run by Aphrodisias. But Agatha somehow managed to preserve her virginity. A furious Quintinian had Agatha racked, scourged, and her breasts cut off. But then these were miraculously restored by a vision of St. Peter. The determined consul had Agatha rolled naked in live coals, mixed with broken potsherds. At length, Agatha died in prison, but she also burned at the stake, and also, when she failed to ignite, beheaded. Gosh, talk about sex and violence. Propagandists would concoct fanciful stories of this ilk, allowing the claim to be made that the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. They would tell of a continuous progress, first in secret and then openly, by which brave, pious, humble and noble followers of Christ faced up both raging lions and sadistic emperors. By their submission to suffering and with a divinely inspired countenance, these pioneers of Christianity, apparently, won first the respect and then the heart of a dark and cruel pagan world. Who persecuted whom? The monks of succeeding ages, who in their peaceful solitudes entertained themselves with diversifying the deaths and sufferings of the primitive martyrs, have frequently invented torments of a much more refined and ingenious nature. Gibbon, Decline and Fall. Across 3 centuries, a handful of Christian martyrs can indeed be cited from a few locations. Their number, far from substantiating any general or sustained persecution of the early Christians, is no more than we would expect of a fraternity that by the time of Constantine's coup amounted to some tens of thousands and was drawn disproportionately from criminal and marginal classes. Constantine seized power, and his ruthless ambition was finessed into a bogus sign of God's approval. The brutal elimination of dissent followed, transformed by church propagandists into a heroic struggle with diabolical forces and darkness. A general persecution of Christians did occur, but only when the Christian Empire turned its ferocity upon the heretics. The Roman Empire had lasted more than 1,000 years and persecuted Christians for fewer than 12 of them. The Christian Empire also lasted more than 1,000 years and persecuted non-Christians through all of them.